everyone, it's Stoof here from the Painting Stoof YouTube channel, or you might recognize me from Travel Season YouTube channel. I am very excited today to announce a massive project that was an idea that just kind of came to me over my years of traveling to national parks. As you know, I have already made many paintings of the national parks that I visited. What I want to do is just create a cohesive body of work of 8 by 10 inch paintings, oil paintings on canvas, like this little guy right here. One painting for every national park that I visited. So I want to start with Acadia National Park. Acadia is in Maine. I have been saving a bunch of photos from all of my national park experiences. The one that I want to paint from Acadia is from Jordan Pond, the view of the bubbles, which are these two little mountain hills that just look like bubbles. So that's what I want to start out with. I want you guys to understand how big of a project this is for me. Not only do I have to visit every national park in the country, which I'm working on, I have to create one painting on an 8-inch by 10-inch canvas of that national park for this body of work. My plan is to eventually have some type of an exhibition, maybe a traveling exhibition. It would be awesome if this exhibition could be up in visitor centers and lodges at national parks. Now that I have let you in on this huge project that I'm about to get started with, let's get started on the first painting of the bubbles at Jordan Pond in Acadia National Park in Maine. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on any future paintings in this massive series of work that I'm about to get started on. All right, let's take a quick look at my oil paint colors for today. So I have burnt umber, cadmium red light, burnt sienna, purple lake, alizarin crimson, raw sienna, yellow ochre in the corner there, a warm white, titanium white, Indian red, lemon yellow, Naples yellow orange. We also have like a cool pink magenta, light magenta color. We have ultramarine blue, phthalo blue, cerulean blue, cobalt blue over there. Also have phthalo green, terra verte, and sap green. Okay, so I'm starting out with a blank 8-inch by 10-inch canvas. I put a little crosshair in the center point of the canvas and little tag marks on the left and right side separating top from bottom. Same in the top center and bottom center separating left from right. That just broke the canvas down into 4 quadrants so I can make a very simplified grid method for translating the proportions of the mountains and features of the painting from the reference photo onto the painting. So I'm just looking at how things appear in the reference photograph and starting to sketch them onto the canvas. For the sketch here, I'm using thin down oil paint. I thin my paint down with citrus solvents. That's by the Milk Paint Company brand. I have a link for that product in my Amazon Associates links under this video. As I'm sketching things out, I'm just loosely putting in where I think I want to place some rocks. I'm not following the reference photo to an exact amount with putting every rock exactly where it is from the reference photo into the painting. I use a little bit of artistic freedom with placement of the rocks. As you'll see later in the painting, I also adjust some things with where I want to put a little bit more water, a little bit more rock, so that the painting feels a little more balanced. As I'm starting to work on the sky, I'm mixing phthalo blue with titanium white. There's also little bits of ultramarine blue and phthalo green mixed in with that sky as well. I didn't just mix one color and make the whole sky that one color. As you can see by the brush strokes, there are some bits that have a bit more white and some bits that have a bit more blue. In general, when I paint a sky during a normal sunshine day like this, midday, I use a bit more of phthalo green and white towards the horizon line and a bit more phthalo blue mixed in towards the top of the canvas farthest up in the sky. I am going to build up a bit more with the sky later, but that's a good base coat for getting started. Next, I started to fill in the shapes for the bubbles there. As you can see, the bubbles are pretty far back in the distance, and I wanted to separate that background from the foreground even more in the painting than what we see in my photograph. So to do that, I mixed in a bit of the color from the sky with that green and purple for the tree-covered portion of the bubbles. And that's what helped mix in those colors to push it farther back in the distance. There's like some atmospheric haze in between your eyeballs and the bubbles back there. So by mixing in little bits of the sky color into the paint, and by not using any super dark values, I can push those mountains farther in the distance, giving us that three-dimensional appearance when you look at the painting. As I continue making my way towards the foreground, filling in this base layer of paint, I mixed in a little bit of a cerulean blue with my phthalo blue to get that warm blue reflecting off the water. There's a section farther back in the water where the water is a bit darker in value, a little bit more blue, and then as we're moving closer to the foreground, the water color is broken up by some little ripples of waves, reflections from rocks, shallowness of the water, things like that change the color of the water, change the color of paint we're using for the water. So this section right here, I am starting to fill in some of those rocks on the water. It's a bit more purple in that area because the water is pretty shallow and there are a lot of rocks right there. I'm loosely painting in shadows for some of the rocks. Whenever you're painting, or reflections, not shadows, whenever you're painting reflections, reflections are going to be slightly lower in value than what the thing is on the surface if it's in sunlight. So those rocks are lit up by the sun on the surface, so the shadow, the reflection is going to be a bit lower in value, and the color is not going to be quite the same in this situation as it is for the rock. So I'm continuing to place in little rocks. Here I'm just using my flat tip brush. It's like a small number 4 flat tip brush. And I'm not using one color to paint in all of the rocks because by mixing in different little subtle bits of browns and purples and blues and ochres to put different little dabs for different rocks, you can see right now, even though this is just a base layer of paint, you can kind of still differentiate between each rock. It doesn't just look like a solid blob of one color. So that makes it easier coming back in later. The rocks are not all going to be the same color. Even if they were all from the exact same monolith or rock feature, rock face, whenever they're down here, they've been, eroded, they've been sanded down from wind and water. Lichen is growing on some of the rocks, moss on some of them. So even if they're all from the same massive body of rock, these boulders that have been going through a lot of different processes are going to have different colors from one another. Now, they're not all going to be the same color. I'm continuing to use my flat tip brush here. The water is getting a bit more purple and brown as we're moving closest to the foreground, where the water starts to not quite look like blue water anymore. We can now see the ground under the water. So by mixing in those purples and umbers, we can start to see some of the rocks below the water. And I love painting clear, shallow water and rocks under the water. I'm going to be putting in a few more rocks on that lower left side in the foreground, middle ground area. And we also have some grasses growing up out of the water that are really colorful, but I'm going to be adding those in after this base layer of paint. Because I'm using oil paint, the paint takes about 5 to 7 days for it to dry. If you really thickly apply your paint, it might take much longer than that. I tend to apply the paint a little bit more on the thin side. So once this layer dries, that's when I go back and start to add more detail to the painting. So this is the base layer of paint. For these rocks over here, I just blocked in a bunch of shadow for now. I decided I will deal with that later because there is a lot going on that lower right foreground. Started to block in a few more shallow rocks on the left, just mixing in bits of crimson and burnt sienna with the blues to show that they're underwater. You don't want the values to be as light as the values for rocks above the water. You want the colors to be different than the rocks above the water. And it's really just taking that flat tip brush, putting little blobs down for different shapes for different rocks. And then after you get little shapes in there, I went back in with the liner brush with that flat tip brush, and I started to mix in some ultramarine blue with umber, maybe a bit of phthalo blue, maybe a bit of doxazine purple as well. And I'm just going with that liner brush so I can get in bits of the shadows under each rock, which help to show that they're underwater as well. Now I just took a bit of brown. I got the base layer of paint down there, so I'm just quickly adding in some little stalks for where the grasses are going to go. First I put little shadows at the base where they're going to pop up out of the water. This is a liner brush that I'm using here, and I thin the paint down with my citrus solvents while mixing it on my palette, and that helps me get those nice thin narrow lines for the grasses. And while the paint's still wet, I wanted to go back to the background area and just start to add in a few ripples of light and color in that background part of the pond. Also add in a few more reflections from the trees and start to add some shadows to the rocks. For the shadows for the rocks, I'm using mostly the same color. I do go back and adjust some things later. But in general, the shadow part of the rocks have more burnt umber, ochre, bits of ultramarine blue. And then the shadows for the rocks closest to the viewer in the foreground are going to have lower value, more contrast, darker shadows, as you can see that gray rock I was just working on. And by just playing around with little different dabs of color on the rock, you can really get that rock texture. That rock that I was working on there, that large rock in the foreground. And I'm continuing to add more shadows around the rocks. This is a small round tip brush. A liner brush would also work here. A flat tip brush could work, but it might give you a bit of a looser appearance. And then I start to add in some of the shadows for the rocks in the middle ground and the shallow water. They're not quite as obvious back here, so it's a bit more of implied brush strokes, a little bit less detail work. And I struggle a bit in this area in the right middle ground. Those shallow rocks in there were a bit tricky for me, so you'll see me go back in there a few times and rework that area. Also adjusting the placement of the rocks. So now that that base layer paint was dry and I'm working on my second layer, I wanted to retouch up some of the rocks that are behind the grasses before going back in with the detail in the grasses. So you always want to work background to foreground to keep things simple when you're painting in a realistic manner. For the grasses, I started with a darker shadow part first, and then I highlight and build up color and values on top of that. So I just started with just a straight up sap green for those long strands using a liner brush. Once I got that sap green on there, I blended in some chromium yellow with some sap green and white, a bit of cad yellow medium, maybe a bit of ochre to get a warmer springtime green for the bits of the grassy stalks that are a little bit more highlighted. And that's like the central part of the stalk. And then the base of the stalk is like a reddish brown. So mixing in crimson with bits of purple and umber for the shadowy part of the red base of the stalks of grass. And then for the highlight on that, white with burnt sienna, or white with a bit of burnt sienna mixed with cadmium red light. Gives you that nice warm red. And I love the red in these grasses. It just ties the full color wheel into this painting. As I am continuing to add detail to the painting, I worked on that section of trees in the left background. Not quite the farthest thing in the background, but still pushing it back. As you can see, my values and shadows in that bunch of trees is darker than my shadows on the trees on the bubbles in the far background on the right. That's something to keep in mind when landscape painting. Features really far in the distance are going to have less change in value than features closer to the foreground. And as we're moving towards these rocks right up in the foreground here, I'm starting to outline individual rocks using my, it's like a thicker liner brush, that one. So at first I'm just like drawing little shapes, painting the little shapes around them with some umber and ultramarine blue, burnt umber or raw umber. And you can see the contrast here is much greater than those trees on the back left. And once I get the outline, they still look flat. So now I want to start to play around with the shadows and the highlights on each individual rock. And as I mentioned, every rock is going to be a different color for the most part. Like you can keep some of the paint on your brush for like 5 or 6 rocks in that cluster, and then go back to your palette, mix in a bit more ochre, and then go back in there, mix in a bit more dioxazine purple, and then go onto a different rock. And then you could like try a different rock with just like a cobalt blue or ultramarine blue with white and a tad bit of ochre. So some rocks are a bit more on the greenish gray side, and some rocks are a bit warmer, more on the ochre side, a little bit more on the pink side as well. After getting those rocks blocked in more, each rock has a bit of a shadow on the lower side of it and a bit more of a highlight on the top part of each rock. So you can see I did that to the rocks as well. I went back in and touched up some of the grasses, added another section of grass there. I wanted the grasses to not just be like one line, so I added some a little closer to the foreground just to add a bit of more depth and draw a diagonal from your field of vision back towards the bubbles in the background. And then I tweaked the placement of the rocks a bit more, added a bit more water in between some of the rocks, touched up the reflections of the grasses in that lower left side, also touched up those shallow rocks in that side as well. And after taking a step back, looking at the painting, I decided to make a couple more minor little adjustments to it. Then I added my signature, and the front of this painting is now complete. I will finish this painting by letting this layer dry, taking one final look at it, seeing if I need to make any more minor adjustments, and then I will paint the side borders of this canvas so that it doesn't require a frame to display it. I'll put a wire mount on the back of it so it's ready to hang, and we can call this first painting of my National Park series complete. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial / talk about my exciting plans for this big project that I just began. Hopefully you found some of this information useful for your own landscape paintings. You can see available original paintings on my website, stephmoracafineart.com. I have that linked under this video. Have a great day and happy painting!